In the last 24 hours, something happened that military analysts said would take a decade to achieve. It happened in weeks, and the world is only now beginning to understand what it actually means. The Strait of Hormuz, the single most strategically important waterway on the planet, has just been declared completely open. But here is the part they are not telling you clearly enough. The U.S. naval blockade remains. Read that again. The strait is open. The blockade stays. And if you think those two things can coexist peacefully, then you have not been paying attention to what is really happening beneath the surface of this war. This is Geo Insight Command, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay locked in, because what we are about to walk through changes the entire map. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this week, not even the beginning of this month. Let us go back to February 28th, because that is the day the world changed, and most people still do not fully understand how. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military strike against Iran. That was the opening move. That was the moment the war began. And since that day, thousands of people have been killed. Oil prices have surged to levels that are creating a political emergency for the very president who ordered the strikes. And now, just weeks later, we are watching something unfold that nobody, not the analysts, not the diplomats, not the intelligence agencies, predicted would happen this fast. Iran's navy is gone. Let that sink in for a moment before we move forward, because this is not a rhetorical claim. This is not media exaggeration. According to Donald Trump, speaking at an event in Las Vegas, Nevada, 158 Iranian ships are at the bottom of the sea. 158. That is not a fleet reduction. That is total naval annihilation. Trump described Iran as, and these are his words, a tough, smart country. He acknowledged that Iranian forces fought hard. He acknowledged their capability. And then he said, they have no navy left. Think about what that means strategically. Think about what it means for the entire Persian Gulf power structure. Think about what it means for every country that has depended on the balance of power in that region to maintain any kind of security, because this changes everything. And we are just getting started. But that is not the real problem. The real problem is what happens next. Because here is the thing about destroying a navy. It does not end a conflict. It reshapes it. When you remove a country's ability to project power at sea, that country does not simply surrender. It adapts. It finds new pressure points. It shifts the battlefield. And Iran, despite losing 158 ships, is still a country with a population of 85 million people, a deeply entrenched ideological government, regional proxy networks stretching from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, and, this is critical, a nuclear program that the world has not yet found a definitive answer to. Destroying a navy is devastating, but it is not the end. And military analysts are already warning that the most dangerous phase of this conflict may not have been the phase where Iran had a navy. The most dangerous phase may be the one we are entering right now. Let us talk about the Strait of Hormuz, because this is the geographic choke point that ties every single one of these events together. 20% of the world's oil passes through that strait. 20%. On any given day, roughly 17 million barrels of crude oil move through a waterway that is, at its narrowest point, approximately 33 kilometers wide. That is not a lot of space. That is barely enough room for 2 lanes of heavy maritime traffic with safety buffers. And for the past several weeks, that strait has been a zone of extreme military tension, with the U.S. naval presence creating what is effectively a blockade of Iranian oil exports. The economic consequences of that blockade have been seismic. Oil prices surged. Global markets reacted. Countries that depend on Gulf oil, which is most of Asia, most of Europe, have been scrambling to find alternatives or pay the premium. The blockade has been one of the most powerful economic weapons the United States has deployed in this conflict. And it has also been one of Trump's most significant political headaches because the price of oil at the pump is not an abstract geopolitical metric. It is something Americans feel every single time they fill up their cars, and it has been hurting. So when Iranian Foreign Minister Sayed Abbas Araghchi posted on Friday that the Strait of Hormuz is declared completely open for the remaining period of ceasefire, that was a massive statement. That was Iran stepping forward and signaling something important, not just that ships can pass, but that Tehran is willing to use the strait as a diplomatic tool. Iran was, in effect, saying, "We are not the ones blocking global commerce. We are opening the door. We are showing the world that we are capable of restraint." It was a strategic communication move as much as a military one, and it worked. Within hours, the headlines across global media were framing Iran as the side that opened the strait. The narrative shifted, even if only slightly. But here is where things get worse, because the U.S. naval blockade remains in place. Let us be very precise about what that means. Iran says the strait is open. The U.S. Navy is still there, still positioned, still capable of intercepting vessels, still maintaining what is effectively a military choke on Iranian maritime commerce, even as the ceasefire creates a temporary pause in active hostilities. You now have a situation where two things that seem contradictory are both simultaneously true. The strait is declared open by one party, and the blockade has not been lifted by the other. This creates a legal ambiguity, a military tension, and a diplomatic minefield that could collapse at any moment. And the fragility of what is happening right now cannot be overstated. The ceasefire is 10 days, just 10 days. And within hours of it taking effect, there were already reports of violations. Let us talk about Lebanon, because it is impossible to understand the Iran situation without understanding what is happening on the Lebanese front, because these two theaters are directly connected. A 10-day ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel went into effect on Thursday. This ceasefire came after strikes on Lebanon that caused massive loss of life and widespread destruction. And those strikes did not just destroy buildings. They threatened the entire fragile structure of the Iran-US ceasefire because Iran viewed the Israeli strikes on Lebanon as a violation of the broader pause in hostilities. Think about the architecture of what is being attempted here. You have an Iran-US ceasefire that is itself fragile. And within that fragile ceasefire, you have a separate Lebanon-Israel ceasefire that is even more fragile. And these two ceasefires are interconnected. A breakdown in one creates pressure on the other. A violation by Israel in Lebanon can be used by Iran to justify escalation. A breakdown in the Iran-US talks can remove the diplomatic pressure that is holding the Lebanon ceasefire together. These are not separate fires. This is one fire with multiple fronts. And this is where things get worse again. The Lebanese army reported on Friday morning that Israel had already committed ceasefire violations, intermittent shelling of southern Lebanese villages. Hours. The ceasefire had been in effect for hours when these reports came in. Israel's military did not immediately deny the shelling. The Arabic language military spokesperson said the Israeli deployment remained in the area in response to continued Hezbollah militant activity. So from Israel's perspective, it was a defensive response. From Lebanon's perspective, it was a ceasefire violation. And from Iran's perspective, every Israeli action in Lebanon is a data point in a larger calculation about whether the broader ceasefire with the United States is worth honoring. This is the trap. This is the architecture of collapse that is already beginning to manifest. But let us zoom out for a moment, because we need to understand the scale of what is actually at stake here. When we talk about the Strait of Hormuz being open, when we talk about ceasefire violations in southern Lebanon, when we talk about 158 Iranian ships at the bottom of the sea, we are not talking about regional events with regional consequences. We are talking about events that ripple outward into the global economy, into the energy markets, into the nuclear non-proliferation architecture that has governed international security since the end of the Cold War. And when Trump stands up and says Iran is a tough, smart country that now has no navy left, he is not just making a military observation. He is making a declaration about the new power hierarchy of the Persian Gulf. He is telling Saudi Arabia, he is telling the UAE, he is telling Qatar, he is telling every Gulf state that has watched this war with a mixture of anxiety and calculated interest that the dominant military force in the Gulf is now unambiguously American. That is a message with consequences that will echo for decades. Intelligence reports suggest that multiple Gulf states have already begun reassessing their security arrangements in light of the destruction of Iranian naval capacity. Countries that previously maintained a careful balance between Washington and Tehran, hedging their bets, keeping communication channels open with both sides, are now recalibrating. Because when one side of the equation is removed from the military balance sheet, the political calculus changes completely. And the reality is that some of these Gulf states are not entirely unhappy with what has happened to Iranian naval power. The rivalry between Iran and the Arab Gulf states is long, deep, and complicated. But the destabilization that comes from a region where one major power has been militarily humiliated is not a stable outcome. Humiliation drives radicalization. Humiliation drives proxy escalation. Humiliation drives the kind of asymmetric warfare that cannot be countered by aircraft carrier groups and naval blockades. Let us now talk about the nuclear question, because this is the variable that changes every other calculation in this conflict. The entire reason the United States launched this war on February 28th, the official justification, the strategic rationale that was presented to Congress, to allies, to the American public, was Iran's nuclear program. And now we are getting our first real glimpse of what a potential deal might look like. According to Trump, Iran has offered not to possess nuclear weapons for more than 20 years. 20 years. That is the Iranian offer on the table. At talks in Islamabad last weekend, the United States proposed a 20-year pause to Iran's nuclear program. Iran counterproposed 5 years, and somewhere between 5 and 20, the fate of the Middle East and arguably the global nuclear order is being negotiated. This is not a small thing. This is not a technicality. This is a civilizational question about whether nuclear proliferation in the world's most volatile region can be contained. Defense experts understand that the gap between a 5-year pause and a 20-year pause is not just about time. It is about what kind of Iran emerges at the end of the pause. A 5-year pause means that the regime that exists today, or a successor regime with similar ideological commitments, could restart a nuclear program within the political memory of current world leaders. A 20-year pause means a generational shift. It means the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East will look fundamentally different by the time any restart becomes possible. It means new alliances, new technologies, new power structures. The difference between 5 and 20 is not 15 years. The difference between 5 and 20 is whether this deal actually means anything or whether it is just a time-buying exercise. And military analysts are already warning that any deal that does not include permanent verification mechanisms, serious enforcement infrastructure, and genuine international buy-in from Europe and Asia, any deal that does not have all of that is not really a deal at all. It is a pause that eventually becomes a crisis. But that is not the real problem either. Because here is the deeper issue that almost nobody is talking about. Even if the United States and Iran reach a deal on the nuclear question, even if they sign something in Islamabad, even if Trump flies to Pakistan for the ceremony, that deal does not resolve the structural tensions that created this conflict in the first place. Iran's regional network of proxy forces, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, these networks were not built by the Iranian Navy. They were built by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They were built through ideology, through financial transfers, through weapons smuggling, through decades of patient organizational work, And those networks are still intact. The Navy is gone, the proxies are not. And in many ways, a militarily weakened Iran that still controls those proxy networks is more unpredictable than a stronger Iran that had something conventional to lose. Now, let us talk about Trump's Pakistan moment, because this is one of the most geopolitically fascinating elements of what is happening right now. A reporter asked Trump whether he would visit Pakistan to seal the peace deal with Iran. And Trump said yes, enthusiastically. He praised Pakistan with the kind of warm language he reserves for countries he considers genuinely useful. He said Pakistan has been great. He said Islamabad, I might go. And if you understand the diplomatic geometry here, you understand why this matters enormously. Pakistan is not a neutral party in the Middle East conflict in any simple sense. Pakistan is an Islamic republic with a nuclear arsenal. It borders Afghanistan and Iran. It has complex relationships with Saudi Arabia, with China, with the United States. Its intelligence services have deep historical connections to militant networks across the region. And its government has, under the current leadership, been attempting to position itself as a constructive diplomatic actor, a bridge between the Muslim world and the Western powers. If Pakistan succeeds in hosting a peace deal between the United States and Iran, if Islamabad becomes the city where this war formally ends, that is a geopolitical transformation for Pakistan's international standing. That is a country moving from the periphery to the center of global diplomacy. And that changes things. And this is where things get worse. Because every major player in the region is watching Pakistan's emerging role with a complicated mixture of reactions. India, which shares a long and contested border with Pakistan and has its own complicated relationship with Iran and the United States, is watching this very carefully. China, which has invested heavily in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and which has its own strategic interests in a stable Persian Gulf energy supply, is watching this very carefully. Russia, which has maintained a complicated semi-partnership with Iran throughout the conflict, and which has everything to gain from prolonged American military entanglement in the Middle East, is watching this very carefully. Saudi Arabia, which has been the largest regional beneficiary of Iranian military degradation, but which is also deeply anxious about what kind of deal emerges and what guarantees it receives, is watching this very carefully. A peace deal in Islamabad is not just a bilateral agreement between Washington and Tehran. It is a seismic event with consequences for the entire international system. Let us now walk through what a deal could look like, and more importantly, let us walk through why every version of a potential deal comes with critical vulnerabilities that could cause the entire structure to collapse. Because the reality is that there is no clean solution here. There is no option on the table that resolves this conflict neatly and permanently. And that is a truth that is not being communicated clearly enough in any of the mainstream coverage. Option 1. Iran accepts the 20-year nuclear pause on U.S. terms. The blockade is lifted. Full ceasefire takes effect. This sounds like a win. On the surface, it looks like exactly what everyone wants. But look more carefully. A 20-year pause that is not backed by ironclad verification infrastructure is a 20-year pause in name only. In name. Iran has shown in the past that it can advance nuclear work in ways that are not fully visible to international inspectors. And a regime that has just watched its navy destroyed and its regional influence constrained is a regime with powerful domestic political pressure to maintain at least a covert pathway back to nuclear capability. Even under a 20-year deal, the knowledge exists. The scientists exist. The centrifuge technology does not disappear. This option reduces the immediate threat, but does not eliminate the underlying dynamic. Option 2, Iran accepts the 5-year pause it proposed, the U.S. rejects it, talks collapse, war resumes. This is the catastrophic scenario. This is what happens if the negotiating gap between 5 and 20 years cannot be bridged. If talks in Islamabad or wherever they happen next break down, you are looking at a return to active military hostilities with a critically important difference from where the conflict began. Iran now has no navy. That means Iranian military strategy shifts entirely toward asymmetric warfare. Proxy escalation intensifies. Hezbollah, even under pressure in southern Lebanon, can still launch rockets into northern Israel. Houthi forces in Yemen can still target Red Sea shipping. Shia militias in Iraq can still attack U.S. installations. And without a navy to be targeted, Iran loses its conventional vulnerability while retaining all of its asymmetric capability. The war becomes harder to fight and harder to end. Option 3. A partial deal is reached. Some elements are agreed upon. The blockade is lifted. The nuclear talks are deferred for a later negotiation. A longer ceasefire is put in place with international monitors. This sounds pragmatic. And it is pragmatic. But it also means that the core strategic question, Iran's nuclear ambitions, remains unresolved. And history teaches us very clearly what happens with unresolved nuclear questions in the Middle East. They do not stay unresolved. They develop, they mature, they become crises. A partial deal buys time, but buying time without using that time to build something durable is not a solution. It is a delayed problem. Option 4, Israel rejects the ceasefire structure. This is not a hypothetical. Israel's defense minister has already said that Hezbollah will be disarmed from south of the Litani River, either through political means or military activity after the ceasefire ends. That is not ambiguous language. That is a clear statement of intent. Israel is signaling that regardless of what happens between Washington and Tehran, its own security objectives in Lebanon will be pursued. And if Israel launches military operations in Lebanon after the 10-day ceasefire ends, if Israeli forces move to forcibly disarm Hezbollah, Iran will be under enormous domestic and ideological pressure to respond, even if Tehran is in the middle of a diplomatic process with Washington, even if a deal is close, because Hezbollah is not just a proxy for Iran. It is a core element of Iran's regional deterrence architecture. An Iran that watches Hezbollah be dismantled without responding is an Iran that loses credibility with every other proxy it relies on. And that credibility is worth more than any one tactical military outcome. Option 5. The ceasefire holds, a deal is eventually signed, but the enforcement architecture fails. This is perhaps the most insidious scenario because it looks like success for the longest time before it becomes a catastrophe. If a deal is signed and the international community does not build a robust verification and enforcement structure, if it is left to the IAEA with limited access, if the snapback provisions are vague, if the geopolitical coalition supporting the deal is shallow, then you have created the illusion of resolution without the substance of it. You have told the world that the Iran nuclear question is solved. You have reduced global attention and political pressure. You have allowed the deal to become accepted baseline reality, and you have given Iran, under a compliant-looking surface, the space to quietly maintain capabilities that eventually become the foundation of a future crisis. Military analysts are already warning that this scenario, the false resolution, is the one that historically leads to the worst long-term outcomes. The truth is that all 5 of these options have critical flaws. There is no clean path through this. And the people who understand that most clearly are not in the media. They are in the intelligence agencies. They are in the military planning offices. They are in the diplomatic back channels where the real conversations are happening. And what those people are saying, what the intelligence reports suggest, is that the window for a genuine, durable resolution to this conflict is narrow. It is not infinite. The domestic political pressures in Iran are real. The pressure from Iranian hardliners who view any deal as capitulation is intense. The pressure from Israeli security officials who are skeptical of any deal that does not include regime change in Tehran is equally intense. And Trump, for all his confidence in Las Vegas about things going swimmingly, is operating in a political environment where his base has been told this war is being won, where any deal that looks like less than total victory will be framed by opponents as a failure. The space in which a real deal can actually be made is smaller than any of the public statements suggest. Now, let us go back to Lebanon for a moment, because something happened in Beirut on Thursday night that tells us something important about what ordinary people feel in the middle of all of this strategic complexity. When the clock struck midnight and the ceasefire went into effect, celebratory gunfire rang out across parts of Beirut. For about half an hour, the sound of rockets fired in celebration could be heard across the city. People celebrated. Because a ceasefire, even a temporary, fragile 10-day ceasefire, represents something that no strategic document, no diplomatic framework, no military analysis can fully capture. It represents a pause in the dying. It represents nights where the sound you hear is celebration instead of bombardment. And that is not nothing. That is not a small thing to the people who live there. But the pause in hostilities remained fragile. That is how the reporting described it. Remained fragile. And within hours, there were reports of shelling. And that fragility is the defining characteristic of everything that is happening right now, not just in Lebanon, in the Strait, in the nuclear talks, in the U.S.-Iran ceasefire, in Trump's hints about a Pakistan visit. All of it is fragile. All of it is held together by a combination of mutual exhaustion, political calculation, and the thin thread of ongoing diplomatic conversation. And any one of a dozen different events, a miscommunication, a rogue strike, a hardliner decision in Tehran, a security cabinet vote in Jerusalem, any one of those events could snap that thread. And when that thread snaps, the fragile architecture does not pause, it collapses. Let us talk about oil. Because the oil price surge that this war has caused is not just an economic statistic. It is a political weapon and a political vulnerability simultaneously. When oil prices rise, every country that imports oil absorbs a shock. Asia absorbs it. Europe absorbs it. The developing world absorbs it most painfully of all, because countries with weaker currencies and thinner economic buffers feel the full weight of energy price inflation in ways that wealthy nations can partially cushion. The surge in oil prices since February 28th has been a major political headache for Trump, as the reporting puts it. And that language, major political headache, is doing a lot of diplomatic work in a very small space. Because what it means in practice is that the U.S. president who launched this war is now under domestic pressure to end it, not because of the human cost, not because of the strategic complexity, but because of what it costs to fill a tank of gas in suburban America. The geopolitics of the Persian Gulf are connected to the price of gasoline in Ohio and Florida and Pennsylvania. And those prices are connected to Trump's approval ratings, and those approval ratings are connected to his political calculus about when and how to make a deal. This is how grand strategy and domestic politics collapse into each other. And defense experts understand that wars end not just when military objectives are achieved, but when the political cost of continuing them exceeds the political cost of stopping. And the oil price surge is accelerating that calculation. Now, there is something else here that requires very careful attention, something that sits beneath all of the headline events and has not received the strategic scrutiny it deserves. The U.S.-Iran war began on February 28th. In a matter of weeks, Iran's navy has been destroyed, a ceasefire with Lebanon has been negotiated, nuclear talks are underway in Islamabad, and Trump is talking about the war ending pretty soon. That is an extraordinary pace of events, extraordinarily fast. And when things move extraordinarily fast in geopolitics, it is worth asking, why so fast? What is driving the urgency? Because rapid escalation and rapid de-escalation in the same conflict theater usually means one of a few things. It means one side has achieved its military objectives, and is now looking to consolidate gains diplomatically. It means both sides have concluded that the costs of continued conflict exceed whatever strategic prizes remain to be captured. Or it means that something has happened or is about to happen that neither side is willing to discuss publicly, that is creating a behind the scenes urgency to reach a resolution before circumstances become even more unmanageable. Intelligence reports suggest that the rapid pace of events is not accidental. The destruction of Iranian naval capacity in weeks rather than months or years is an outcome that required extraordinary military coordination, extraordinary intelligence preparation, and an extraordinary willingness to absorb the international criticism that comes with the kind of military escalation that sinks 158 ships. That does not happen by accident. That is a deliberate campaign, and a deliberate campaign of that scale executed that quickly suggests that the United States entered this conflict with a very specific set of military objectives that it intended to achieve rapidly, precisely because a prolonged war was strategically untenable. The oil prices were always going to be a problem. The domestic political pressure was always going to build. The international criticism was always going to mount. The calculation was move fast, achieve the military objectives, then shift to the diplomatic phase before the political cost becomes unbearable. And that is exactly what appears to be happening. But the question that matters most is not whether the military phase succeeded. The question is whether the diplomatic phase can actually deliver what the military phase was supposed to make possible. And this is where we arrive at the deepest issue of all, the one that military analysts are talking about in private, and that has not yet broken through into mainstream coverage in a way that fully conveys its importance. The nuclear question is not just a technical question about centrifuges and enrichment levels and inspection protocols. It is a question about the fundamental nature of the Iranian state and what it needs to survive. Iran's nuclear program is not a foreign policy position. It is a domestic political instrument. For the hardline elements of the Iranian government, the elements that have real power independent of the elected leadership, the nuclear program represents sovereignty, security, and the insurance policy against exactly the kind of military devastation that Iran just experienced. When 158 ships are at the bottom of the sea, the argument for a nuclear deterrent does not weaken, it strengthens. Every hardliner in Tehran just watched Iran's conventional military capacity get obliterated by American firepower. And the lesson those hardliners draw from that experience is not that Iran should disarm. The lesson is that without a nuclear deterrent, Iran will always be vulnerable to exactly this kind of devastating strike. And that lesson, that logic, is what makes the nuclear negotiations so extraordinarily difficult. Because you are not just negotiating with a foreign government. You are asking a political system to make a decision that runs directly counter to the security lesson it just learned from its own military catastrophe. The Iranian foreign minister declaring the Strait of Hormuz open is a signal of pragmatism. It is a signal that the moderate elements of the Iranian government, the ones who calculate that a deal is better than continued war, are currently in a position to make diplomatic gestures, but they are in that position because the war has gone badly enough that the cost of continuing is obvious. That calculation can change. If the nuclear talks stall, if the U.S. demands prove to be too far from what Iran can politically accept, if Israel takes military action in Lebanon that Iran feels compelled to respond to, if the domestic political cost of appearing to capitulate under military pressure becomes too great for the Iranian leadership to manage. Any of those conditions can shift the balance of internal Iranian politics away from the pragmatists and toward the hardliners. And when that shift happens, it does not happen slowly. It happens fast. And this is where things get worse in a way that is almost impossible to fully convey, because the window in which a deal is possible may be measured not in months, but in weeks. The fragile ceasefire lasts 10 days. The naval blockade remains. The nuclear gap between 5 and 20 years has not been closed. And every day that passes without a deal is a day in which the conditions that make a deal possible becomes slightly less favorable. What happens if this all breaks down? What does the failure scenario actually look like on the ground? Military analysts are already gaming this out. If the ceasefire collapses, if nuclear talks fail, and if the US and Iran return to active hostilities, the conflict enters a fundamentally different phase. Iran, without a navy, shifts its entire military posture to asymmetric and proxy warfare. Hezbollah launches sustained rocket campaigns against northern Israel. Houthi forces intensify attacks on Red Sea commercial shipping. Iraqi Shia militias escalate attacks on U.S. installations. And Iran, feeling existentially threatened, potentially accelerates rather than pauses its nuclear program. The United States finds itself in a conflict that cannot be ended by naval power because there is no more Iranian naval power to destroy. The battlefield becomes invisible. It becomes distributed across multiple countries, multiple proxy organizations, multiple methods of attack that are much harder to attribute, much harder to target, and much harder to counter. Oil prices surge further. The global economy absorbs another shock. U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria face increased pressure. Israel faces a multi-front security emergency, and the diplomatic options narrow rapidly because the political will to negotiate dissolves when the shooting intensifies. This is the nightmare scenario. And it is not a far-fetched nightmare. It is the logical outcome of a process that is already showing cracks. The ceasefire violations in Lebanon within hours of the ceasefire taking effect are not just a technical military issue. They are a preview. They are what breakdown looks like in its early stage. The question is whether the political systems involved in Washington, in Tehran, in Jerusalem, in Beirut, have the discipline and the strategic wisdom to pull back from that edge. And history does not give us a lot of reasons for optimism when we look at how ceasefire violations tend to escalate. But there is something else to hold on to, something that the relentless focus on the military and diplomatic dimensions of this conflict sometimes obscures. The fact that talks are happening at all is significant. The fact that Iran declared the strait open is a strategic signal, not just a technical statement. The fact that Trump said the war is going to end pretty soon and said it publicly in Las Vegas at an event with cameras is a political commitment that creates its own momentum. Leaders who say wars are about to end publicly in front of large audiences have staked their credibility on that outcome, and Trump's political identity is deeply connected to his self-image as a deal maker. The Iran war ending with a deal, with his deal signed possibly in Islamabad, possibly with a visit from Trump himself, is the kind of outcome that fits the narrative he wants to tell about his presidency. And that political incentive, as impure as it might seem from a purely strategic standpoint, is actually one of the most powerful forces pushing toward a resolution. Presidents end wars not just because of strategy. They end wars because of legacy. The question that haunts this entire situation, the question that will define what this conflict means for the next generation, is not whether a deal gets signed. It is whether the deal that gets signed actually means something, whether the verification is real, whether the enforcement is credible, whether the underlying tensions between Iranian regional ambitions and American strategic interests have been managed or merely paused, whether Hezbollah's disarmament from south of the Litani, which Israel's defense minister has made clear is a non-negotiable objective, can be achieved through political means, as the ideal scenario envisions, or whether it will require military action that reignites everything, whether Pakistan's role as a diplomatic host becomes the foundation of a new regional architecture, or whether it is a one-time moment of pragmatic convenience that fades as soon as the ink is dry. And the answer to all of those questions will not be found in the next press conference. It will not be found in the next Trump statement outside the White House. It will be found in what happens in the next 10 days, in whether the Lebanese ceasefire holds or collapses, in whether the negotiations in whatever city they happen next manage to close the gap between 5 years and 20 years. in whether the U.S. naval blockade is eventually lifted or whether it becomes a permanent fixture of a new Persian Gulf power structure, in whether the 85 million people of Iran look at what has happened to their country and decide that their government needs to find a way out, or whether they rally behind a hardline posture born of military humiliation and national pride. Those are the real variables, and nobody, not the intelligence agencies, not the military analysts, not the diplomats, not even the principals themselves, knows with certainty how they resolve. What we do know is this. In the last 24 hours, the world moved. The Strait of Hormuz was declared open. A ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel went into effect and almost immediately began to show cracks. Trump stood at an event in Nevada and said 158 Iranian ships are at the bottom of the sea and the war should be ending pretty soon. And somewhere between those facts, between the open strait and the remaining blockade, between the ceasefire and the violations, between the optimism and the fragility, the future of the Middle East is being written in real time. This changes everything, not because any single event has been resolved, but because the architecture of power in the Persian Gulf has been fundamentally altered in a matter of weeks, an architecture that took decades to build. Decades of proxy wars and nuclear negotiations and sanctions and diplomacy and strategic patience and occasional military escalation, all of it has been compressed into weeks. And what emerges from the compression, what gets built on the rubble of 158 ships and the fragile cement of a 10-day ceasefire, is going to define the geopolitical order that the next generation inherits. The real issue is something deeper than any of the individual events we have walked through today. The real issue is that we are watching in real time the negotiation of a new regional order. And new orders, new arrangements of power, are almost never built cleanly. They are built through war, through diplomatic crisis, through miscalculation and correction, through the gradual exhaustion of options until the only option left is accommodation. And we are not at the accommodation stage yet. We are in the messy middle, where the ceasefire is fragile, where the talks are ongoing, where the blockade remains even as the strait is declared open, where everything is in motion and nothing has settled. So here are the questions that matter. Can a deal between Washington and Tehran be built that closes the gap between 5 years and 20 years without creating a domestic political collapse in Tehran? Can Israel's security objectives in Lebanon be met without triggering a wider escalation that breaks the entire ceasefire architecture? Can the United States maintain the strategic gains from the destruction of Iranian naval power while simultaneously constructing a diplomatic framework that gives Iran enough of what it needs to accept a deal? And if all of that is managed somehow, if a deal is signed, if Trump visits Islamabad, if the ceasefire holds, what happens to the proxy networks? What happens to Hezbollah? What happens to the Houthis? What happens to the Shia militias in Iraq? Because those networks do not disappear with a signature. And the answer to that question is the answer to whether this is the end of this chapter or just the beginning of the next one. Stay close, stay informed, because the next 72 hours could change everything we just discussed. Again, if this breakdown gave you clarity on something the mainstream coverage is missing, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening. Subscribe to Geo Insight Command and keep watching, because this story is not over, not by a long way.